It's 101, Laura. Shall we start? Okay, guys, we are going to start. And what the plan is we're going to go through this sort of quick overview in terms of where we are and where we're going. And then we're going to ask everyone to come on camera and have a conversation. Oh, apparently we're going to start at the back. Awesome. Well, first of all, thank you guys. Thank you for choosing to be with us for this penultimate session. Be sure to join us for the closing remarks because Jackie and I are going to have a little fun with everyone since we didn't get to be in person. So just want to put that out for right now. So Open Science and IES, where have we been and where are we going? That is what we are going to talk about here. For those of you who don't know Albro and Namy, I'm realizing not everyone might know her. Albro and Namy is the Associate Commissioner for Teaching and Learning, and she's been with us for coming up on 2 years, right?
Almost 2 years.
Yeah. And Laura is my partner in crime. I don't know if it's the right word. She and I work together very closely on the open science work here at IES. All right. And with that, next slide, please. All right. So today we're going to talk about sort of two broad topics. First, I want to talk with you a little bit about the SEER principles, what we've been trying to do in the context of SEER to provide supports to all of us around open science. And then we're going to talk about the things that I know many of you are probably concerned about or have questions about in terms of current and future public access requirements for IES-funded research and research training projects. So for those of you who don't remember SEER, you don't have it committed to memory, we've just written it here. But I think that the main point and the piece that's really important for us today is that very first sentence, right? So from IES's perspective, rigorous education research requires us to be transparent and actionable in addition to being focused on consequential outcomes. And when I think about the way that open science plays into the work that we do, it really is intended to make sure that what we are learning that is actionable is also transparent and available to our broad community, the broad community who's interested in our work. If you don't know the SEER principles, copy that website and go to it because there's lots of resources that we're going to just kind of talk quickly through right now. So these are the SEER principles. And as you all know, the principles continue to be expanded upon. Our most recent principle that we added is the third one there, addressing questions of equity and inequities and learners' opportunities, access to resources and outcomes. But the purpose of today's conversation is really to talk about two components to the open science conversation that we are hoping to make sure that everybody does. So the first is pre-registration. I think many of you all know that we expect all of our impact studies and our exploration studies to pre-register to the degree that they can. And we have a requirement. Oops, my speaking language is English, I think. And that we are doing everything we can to make sure that the findings from our studies, the methods that we're using, and the data that results from our studies is open and available for others to use in the context of learning more and learning together. So pre-registration. So here's the sort of the list of what's required. So causal impact studies that are supported through the two research centers must be pre-registered in a recognized study registry. So places like the Open Science Framework, places like REIS, they're supposed to document, you guys, I should speak to you directly as opposed to they, document your confirmatory research questions and planned analytic activities. And as you know, when you do a pre-registration, the intent here is that you will update that information as changes are made in responses to changes on the ground, right? We know that everyone over the COVID period, we all had great plans in 2019, right? We all had things that we were gonna do. And then COVID happened and things had to shift and change. The hope and goal of open science is that through pre-registration, you would go in and update your registry and say, okay, so we had to change the delivery mode of the intervention, right? We had to go from in-person to online, or we had to change our sample site. All of these sorts of things can and should be tracked through the pre-registration format and the pre-registration location that you all have chosen to store your work in. All right, Laura, next one, please. It's slow. It's all good. All right. So here's an interesting thing. I was given a talk, Laura and I were giving a talk a couple months ago, and we were trying to figure out where our studies had been pre-registered. Many folks have, of course, sent us information, but one of the things that we have learned and one of the challenges that we hope that you all can help us think through is that finding IES studies that have been pre-registered is actually not as simple and straightforward as you think. So we've listed just 3 examples here. So REIS is the pre-registration site that is associated with SRI. We were able to find 166 IES funded studies there. The Open Science Framework only had 14. And last time I presented this, people were like, wait a minute, my stuff is there. But there was no way for us to figure that out. So this is an open question and concern that we have, because it's not open if you can't find it. So that's a question for us to think about. And on clinicaltrials.gov, I could only find 7 IES funded studies. So that's just the frame in terms of pre-registration and what we're thinking about. You guys all know, and everybody received an email from me last night through grants.gov, through G5 rather, not grants.gov, talking about public access, particularly around manuscripts and the things that we need to be doing in order to make sure that our manuscripts and our papers are available through ERIC. Here, I'm going to speak this, and it might be complicated and we should talk about it. For the vast majority of you, the expectation is that you are submitting electronic versions of your final approved manuscripts through the grantee submission portal in ERIC. We do have a small subset of journals, including AERA Open, that have, through Sage Publication, that have an agreement with ERIC, which allows for your publications to the full text of your publications to be immediately available on ERIC. We are hoping, and Doug, this is for you, we are hoping in the future to get to a place where more of our agreements are like that, to reduce burden on you all as investigators. But right now, the fail-safe to make sure that we're in compliance and that you're in compliance is to submit that final manuscript to ERIC, and then that means that the full PDF will be available to the public for free in perpetuity. And ERIC is the place where you must deposit things. Okay, so here, okay, so I'm like, what did I write? So what's really been fun, and those of you who have been PIs and know that I've been reporting on this repeatedly, is that we have been seeing increasing compliance. Thank you to all of you, because we can't do our work without you. And so far, we have 2,704 grantee submission records in ERIC. Now we know that there are many more publications that are not included in ERIC in the grantee submission portal, because many projects were funded that predated our public access requirement, right? So the public access requirement that was first initiated was in 2013. I will simply say that if you are so inclined, you are more than welcome to submit publications that came out from your earlier work into ERIC so that it is there for everyone to be able to see and use. But thanks to everyone who's already been doing the good work and helping us get our numbers up. Data sharing. So this is another place where we are working hard, but we are just at the beginning. Many of you guys know that you had to prepare, for those of you who had causal impact and exploration studies, part of your grant application was to prepare a data management plan where you laid out what are your plans for sharing data as required in a way that protects the privacy of students and other participants, but also meets the need for the meta-analysts, for example, who are on the call, who want to be able to pull together findings across and data across different studies. So we are making, one of the things that Laura is going to talk about is that there are some new plans and new expectations around how we're going to do this work together in the new plan. And I'm not going to talk about that because she's going to. So we're going to be quiet on that. For those of you who on the SEER pages, we have included the top publication, Sharing Study Data, a Guide for Education Researchers, that was produced under a contract that we have that is meant to be providing resources for you all. So for those of you who don't have lots of experience preparing your study data for public sharing, this is a really useful beginner's tool. I would recommend sharing it honestly with your grad students and postdocs. The only way we're going to change the field is if we're changing the field for everyone. And it's a really good beginning primer, if you will, for folks to do that. The other document that we wanted to share here, this came out of the National Science and Technology Council and is part of the interagency work that Laura and I have been part of, that talks about the desirable characteristics of the places where you're planning to store your data. And so if you have not yet made a decision about where to plan to store your data, or if you're having second questions, we can make sure to do that. And I see the question about putting the links in the chat, and Laura, we can do that, but we'll probably do it at the end after we go through the slides. Okay, so that's that. So to get that done. So what are we learning about all of these things? So I will say, oh, thanks, John. Discoverability is a challenge. I flagged that already for you. We are having internal conversations trying to figure out how to improve discoverability, because the promise of open becomes really broken if we can't find anything. So we have data sets. I mean, just like pre-registration, data sets are harder to find. In ICPSR, we see 42 data sets. OSF holds at least 25. We know that a lot of the other data is residing in university managed repositories across the nation. At this point, we, IES, don't have a good way to pull and track that information. So we are trying to think of solutions, and we are hoping that you all have some ideas that you can share back with us. And I think it's Laura's turn, and you're going to keep driving, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm going to stop talking, and you guys are going to hear from Laura as she's going to talk about what are the requirements, where have we been, and where are we go.
Thank you, Liz. So yes, this is going to be a little bit redundant with what we said earlier, but just to sort of review and reinforce kind of where we have been, where we are now, and most importantly, to our goal here today is to orient you to where we're going, what's coming up, and how we're thinking about it. And then to have some discussion so that you all can share questions or concerns or potential pain points, etc. So, the is over my screen here. Okay. The history of public access requirements specifically at IES. And this is most of this happened prior to my arrival. So I'll do a royal we here. In 2011, IES established publication and data sharing requirements for grantees. It wasn't until 2013 that there was any sort of centralized federal government guidance around this. In 2013, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and you'll see us refer to OSTP, issued the Holdren memo, so named for John Holdren, who was the director of OSTP at that time, provided initial guidance on the need for federally funded researchers to share publications and develop plans for sharing. So that was sort of the first initiation of some needs to move towards a more open science framework. In 2016, the Department of Education as a whole established a public access guide and policy that IES had, of course, led on. But that is the current policy that is in existence in place right now. In August of last year, the White House OSTP issued the Nelson memo, so named for Alondra Nelson, who was the director, their acting director at the time, provided updated guidance on public access to and discoverability, which is something Liz has mentioned earlier, of research, publications, data, and metadata. So we are in a phase now where we are attempting to implement in a phased process the guidance from that Nelson memo. So as we just mentioned, our current policies are that IES requires all peer-reviewed scholarly publications produced with IES funding to be publicly available. Oh, it says Aaron, not Eric. Sorry, it's Eric. Either after 12 months publisher embargo or after publication. So you can upload versions, and for those that are publishing open access, you can upload the full article. And I think most of you probably know this, but just to make it very, very explicit, grant funds can, may, and should be used to pay article processing charges, APCs, to support open access publishing. And then data sharing is that exploratory and causal impact projects are required to submit a data management plan with their grant application and to make plans to make those data accessible post-publication. Here's an outline, and I'm going to do it piece by piece because there's a lot of things that I want to make sure that you're aware of and to sort of think through one by one the kind of the implications of the actual Nelson memo. So first of all, the guiding impetus for the Nelson memo is to focus on fostering equity in science. Accessibility, equal access is sort of the framework for how this is all going to get implemented. There's a ramp up period. So we are not expected and required to have guidance implemented until December 31st, 2025. IES, again, as in the earlier phases, is attempting to be on the leading edge of this. So we anticipate that we will be implementing at least some of this guidance in advance of 2025, including potentially in the next round of RFAs that are being released this summer. So keep an eye out for some of that. The biggest, most sort of impactful change that you're going to see for the publishing part of the industry here is that there is a change from the 12-month embargo to a 0-day embargo on all publications stemming from all federally funded work. This is a big change for people who have been accustomed to publishing in non-open access journals. This is a huge change for the publication industry, for the journals. As you can imagine, there's a mixed response on the part of publishers in terms of how they're working to accommodate this. Some are fighting very, very hard against this because they're operating on models where that 12-month embargo gives them a chance to have some income from the publication in advance of that embargo release. As you know, it's sort of pushing the whole industry towards open access. So this is going to have implications for you all because it means that you are expected to share the articles that are being accepted on the day that they are accepted and published. Data sharing. This is also going to be a change, which will be important for those of you who kind of tend to publish off data for multiple years over the course of a kind of once you've finished out the data collection phase of the award. Data sharing will be required at the time of publication, or if you have not yet published the data after a certain time interval, and agencies are going to have variability with respect to what that time interval is going to look like, you are required to share those data after a particular time interval, regardless of whether you've published yet or not. So it's a whichever comes first, either you published or you hit that time interval. And so we're not yet at a point where we can share what our time interval is going to be, but that's certainly something that you'll want to keep in mind for future projects when you're thinking through obligations to share the data and how you're going to prioritize your publications. Many agencies are shifting or have shifted, and you should expect that all agencies, okay, thank you, Lisa, so I can say it. We will be shifting to a data sharing and management plan rather than a data management plan. This is to foreground the routine practice of data sharing, and there will be some, of course, accompanying kind of guidance language around that. So be on the lookout for that. One big emphasis that you'll see if you look at the public access memo that relates to some of the things that Liz was sharing earlier is that there's going to be a shift towards consistent use of unique digital persistent identifiers, or PIDs, across all different categories of this research enterprise. So individuals will need to have identifiers, and ORCID is the one that's best known amongst our community in terms of having an identifier, a digital identifier that refers to specific individuals and that you can track people's locations and affiliations. You can track name changes, you can track publications, you can track grant funding through ORCIDs. I will put in a bid now, and you will see us continue to do so. We certainly encourage everyone in our community to go ahead and establish an ORCID. It's very easy to do. You'll find that lots of stuff gets populated once you create that, and so it's an opportunity for you to collate in one place where all of your published works are. But we're also going to be seeing unique persistent identifiers for other things that we haven't routinely been utilizing. One is for publications, which we're all very familiar with, DOIs, digital object identifiers. That's been sort of the coin of the realm for a long time. So digital object identifiers, DOIs, will can persist for publications, but we're also needing to have universal but persistent digital identifiers for awards. And that means something that's not just the grant number that IES issues for you, but something that can be sort of universally identified across different funding sources and funding agencies, and also identifiers for data sets. So that's all going to be coming up in the future, and is going to be a really important way for us to be able to find data sets, right? Be able to link them to public abstracts, be able to link them to the awards that they came from, be able to connect individuals with the data sets that they've produced. So this is part of sort of creating a better ecosystem of being able to track and discover where those data sets exist, how the data sets are linked to the awards, how the publications are linked to the data sets, et cetera. And so part and parcel of that interlinking is the use of rich metadata when sharing publications and data. By metadata, we're referring to using those PIDs, those identifiers, to mention individuals, to mention awards, whenever you're posting or sharing a publication or data. Right now, often the information about awards, for example, appears in like an acknowledgement section in text, so it's not especially findable or machine readable. So this is part of a process of making everything much more automated and easily findable online. So that's the major gist of what is in the memo. Each agency that provides research funding within the federal government is working to develop its public access policy that shows implementation of these requirements. So the Department of Education as a whole is working towards establishing this policy by the time that December 31st, 2025 deadline rolls around. But IES is working to implement at least some of this in advance of that deadline. And we have a sort of separate, I won't get into details, but it's a separate kind of authority to be able to implement some of those details in advance of the Department of Education's policy. So I will put these in the link after I stop sharing screen. But if you are interested, here's the public access memo link. It's a link to a PDF. And then we also wanted to give you a heads up that OSTP in anticipation of implementation of these new requirements is scheduling some listening sessions, in particular for early career researchers, so that they can better understand what some of the implications would be, what some of the opportunities are around implementation. So there's a series of 4 webinars that are happening. I think the first one is happening at the end of May, and then 3 in June. So you can go to this link and register to participate in some of these listening sessions to share your perspective on how these public access steps are going to be instantiated. We've already had a chance to identify some potential concerns, both on our end in terms of thinking about implementation, but also on, of course, on how it will affect you all. One is managing the 0-day embargo, right? How do we navigate publisher policies? What versions are we supposed to share? Timing pressure to get things into ERIC as soon as they're published. And we will be working to help provide guidance on and manage expectations about that. One thing to note and acknowledge is that although this open access approach and this 0-day embargo is serving the needs of equity with respect to access to information, it's not necessarily the most equitable approach if we are relying exclusively on APC-based models. If everyone who wants to publish has to have the funds to publish open access, that does create some barriers to equity. So that's certainly something that we're aware of. It's certainly something that publishers are aware of, and it's something that we're thinking through how best to support as a potential concern with the new policy guidance. This is a culture change, right? This is a different way of thinking about science than those of us who are Liz and my age definitely grew up with. And I know that there's been, there's a lot of people who are very excited about this and have been on the bleeding edge and are excited to agitate for moving us forward, and others that are anxious. And we want to be having conversations with both of those groups and people in the middle who are kind of just waiting to see how it all plays out. But we recognize that this is a sea change, and we want to find ways to do what we can as a field to incentivize routine open data sharing, for example. And we are definitely focusing on the role of training programs as one particularly effective way to shift culture, right? The young folks coming up through the pipeline are always the best way to help facilitate change. But we're certainly interested in hearing from you about other ways to help support this culture change. Liz mentioned the issue of sort of discoverability of data sets as we come up with the perfect system where suddenly all the persistent identifiers for all the sources of information are all interconnected and interwoven across databases and resources. This will become less of a problem. That's certainly an aspirational goal, and it's going to take time for systems to be able to support this. But that is certainly something that's a concern, is that, you know, if a data set falls in the woods and nobody knows it exists, then it's not necessarily accessible and useful, right? That sharing is only one piece of discoverability and accessibility. We recognize, and this is something that's been an issue on the forefront for a long time, that protecting proprietary and sensitive or identifiable data is really important, especially as we are working harder to make sure that we are providing context and taking into account issues about the characteristics of our samples. That can sometimes be a little bit of a counterweight to sharing, because you do sort of narrow the possible prospects for identifiability. Consistent use of persistent identifiers is going to be a challenge. We are all going to have to get used to using these consistently across individuals, publications, data sets, and awards. So that will be something that we'll continue to be thinking about as a community. And then, you know, being able to figure out how to assess the impact of these new federal policies. Is this actually creating enhanced opportunities for people to have access, or are the sort of idealized versions of this openness not actually resulting in people taking advantage of opportunities to conduct richer meta-analyses or conduct a secondary data analysis, being able to find and make use of available data and publications. And then we want to hear from you about what other concerns you're thinking about. So just briefly, we try to pop this up on any talk. So here's our QR code, bookmark the funding page so you can keep an eye on what's coming out in terms of funding opportunities. Here's our contact info. You can certainly find us relatively easily online, Twitter, Facebook, etc. And I will stop sharing now so that you all can come on camera or unmute or raise your hand or post something in the chat. I guess you can't raise your hand. Post something in the chat or questions. It looks like I haven't been able to look at it, but there's plenty of stuff accumulating so that we can start to have a conversation here. And I will start popping into the chat the links that are embedded in the presentation.
All right, thank you guys. Thanks for all the great questions. Many of them are ones that we expected to see. So I'm trying to think where I'm going to start. I think I'm going to start first with the state and local data set question, right? People have quite a bit of concerns about what does data sharing mean when we don't have a power or authority to share data. I want to remind everyone that if you read through the data sharing and management plan, part of the plan in those situations is to talk about what are you able to share? Are you able to share what are the variables that you used? What is the code you used? How did you create the data set? The idea here is to provide information so that someone else could potentially replicate or pull the data together. We are not naive enough to, I don't know, I can't speak for my colleagues at OSTP. We are not naive enough to believe that we have the power to overturn state and local access to data. That's not sort of a power that we have. But what we want you all to help us think about and to share is how much information can you provide so that if someone wanted to go in and replicate your analysis, or if someone wanted to go in and do some meta-analytic work, they had all the information about what are the variables, what are the lines, what are the challenges, how did you create definitions? Maybe you were moving, like maybe, for example, you wanted to identify students with disabilities across multiple different states or multiple districts. And we know that all of the data sets don't define disability in the same way, right? So like, what are the decisions that you had to make? It's that level of information that we're expecting to come out of much of the data that you are using to analyze outcomes that you don't own, right? So I want to just make it clear that when we talk about data sharing and management, it's not like you're going to have to violate your IRB agreements with states and districts. That would not work for any of us, right? So that would make it really hard. So just hopefully that is clear to you guys, but please do ask additional questions. I think the other question that came up around here, and Laura, if you want to answer it, you can, and if you don't, you can just ping it back to me in the Q&A that folks haven't seen is data and copyright. And that's, I just had the question says for data, what if there are copyright concerns?
Yeah, so this is certainly something that we'll be trying to spell out more in our guidance, recognizing that there are proprietary issues to be taken into consideration. One of the things that we are hoping to be able to do is provide some guidance on licensing in terms of data. The advice that we're getting is to keep things as open as possible in terms of the licensing agreements to minimize those barriers. But certainly if there are concerns about anything being, either sensitive or having sort of commercial implications and those sorts of things, we recognize that the space is complicated. And so we're hoping that we'll be able to provide some guidance on that.
I'm talking to myself, which I do frequently. So just a reminder to everyone that the other thing to remember is that even in the context of sort of data sharing, you as a researcher retain your copyright to the information, right? So even if you're sharing something, if you're sharing a publication, you still retain your copyright. So, and we can go into all of the legal details around that, but I don't want people to think they're giving up their copyright in the context of sharing. So Laura, you ready for another question? I'm reading the ones that are in the Q&A. You guys can see all the chat in the other part. So Sonia Cabell asks, and this is a question we've heard before, Sonia, so we might even have an answer for you. Publications are often accepted after the award period has ended. And so it is difficult to use the funds from the award itself for open access publication. Is there a way to have access to a more flexible fund to publish open access within a certain time period after an award has ended? Laura, take it away.
Do I know the answer to that? I mean, the best approach there is to anticipate and ask for a no-cost extension to be able to make use of those funds.
And I think the other thing is that if you're going to publish, we're going to be working very hard with the publishers. So like the ERIC and our ERIC team is working with publishers to try to minimize some of that. But this is the reason why we always have that fallback of don't sign away when you sign that agreement for your publication. Don't sign away your agreement to retain that manuscript, and that you can submit that manuscript for free to ERIC, right? And that will meet
so as long as you're as long as you're retaining those rights, then you can upload the accepted version, and that is consistent with sharing policies.
Yeah. Does that make sense, Sonia? So yeah, I mean, we're certainly aware of it, and it's come up. I think it's come up in every conversation that OSTP and our federal colleagues have been having, NIH and NSF, in response to this.
So just a quick follow-up to that. So are you saying that even if we don't publish in an open access journal, we have to pay a fee for the open access portion, publication in ERIC will then make it available more, so that will fulfill the open access portion. Okay.
Exactly. So, right. Yeah. The whole grantee submission process. And I sent out, just so you guys know, because I thought this was a great time to capture your attention. I used G5 last night and everybody got a blast email that includes 2 YouTube video links to the process to do a grantee submission. That's for our current policy, but hopefully it's helpful as you're thinking through and getting practiced in this whole process. But please send us questions as you guys are trying to do this. We're trying to make this process as seamless as it can be for everyone. All right, Michael Kiefer, you have told me there's lots of questions here in the chat. Laura, do you have one you want to flag for us to talk about, or does someone want to just hear? All right.
I'm reading as I go here. Let's see.
I want to just, in terms of the concerns that might come from our state and district partners, thinking about like, what are the supports that we can provide to make it clear to folks why we care about this stuff? I mean, even understanding that we may never be able to break the restrictions that exist because of FERPA, like what are the kinds of documents that we want to share with our partners to make sure that they're aware that this move toward transparency is meant to be supportive, helpful, and not like punitive, right? Which I think sometimes is what states and districts are often concerned about. Love to hear thoughts. Summit Labs, John Whitmer, who's a colleague of ours here, thought about, do we need to have a document about use and limitations of what the data is intended to do, statement of intent around equity and research. So love to hear thoughts about this.
So Michael, you had asked about, is the deadline for sharing based on the last paper? No, it's going to be relative to the end of the award. So the timing is going to be specified relative to the end of the award. And some agencies are going to take very sort of aggressive, like you got to, you know, the last day of the award is the day that you have to release it. Others are going to have more of a lead time. We won't tip our hand yet because we're not actually authorized to do so at this point, but that it's going to be linked to the award that funded the work, rather than to like when you've just published. If that makes sense. Russell, you had asked about linking information about assessments used in the data set into the code book, especially for item level data. That's a great question. I think that this is part of why there's been some development of guidance, such as the link that we provided to the data sharing guide. It's really obviously important if you're including item level data from a particular instrument for people to be able to discover and recover that. I think, you know, at minimum, referring in your code book to what the items are and what the instrument is so that people can recover that for themselves is very important. And that leads me to flag one other thing that is sort of in the ether right now that we're talking about, which is the importance when sharing data of also, when possible, sharing your analysis code, so that it sort of helps to foster reproducibility, so that there are opportunities to do those sorts of discoverability processes.
Christy has a question, Laura, here, where she wants to know if this will apply to grant-funded research that's already underway but completed after December 2025.
Good question. No, you are under current guidance. So anything that that the funding was initiated prior to 2025 will be under the current policies we'll be implementing just for new awards starting in 2026.
Yeah, although I will say that what we're hoping will happen, and we'll see what happens, right? This is a really interesting time. And unlike last time where we were catching up, we're actually kind of ahead of the game on this one, is to see what happens with journals. So if journals actually move to a more like a zero embargo model, as they're going to have to, what may happen is that you are going to be in compliance, if you will, by default, at least for the publications, right? Because the journals that you're publishing in are going to be in compliance, independent of when your award was funded. So it's a conversation that we're currently having and thinking about. All right.
Ben, you asked a really important question about de-identifying qualitative data for sharing. That's not been a huge conversation at the federal level because, of course, we're talking across agencies that don't actually do behavioral or human subjects research. I think that's a really important thing for us to be thinking about as we're providing that kind of guidance, is what are best practices around that, and how can we help the community to orient towards preparing their data sets from the beginning. And this is something that I think a lot of us have talked a lot about and has come up in the sharing of that NCEE posted guide. Is how do you start curating data from the beginning in a way that makes it readily shareable? Because it's such a huge lift, and we recognize that, to have to take the data set that you've been using, your lab specific or group specific approach for so long, and convert it into something that anybody else can use. So that's part of, I think, that sort of enculturation and adaptation process that we're all needing to go through, is thinking through how do we set up data from the beginning to make life much easier for ourselves at the back end. I think that the burden and the sort of nuances of that are much greater for qualitative work. And so, yeah, thinking through around how to do that best is a really important thing for us to be chewing on.
All right, Shane, sorry, Laura, didn't mean to talk on top of you. Shane, I love your comment here to have an infographic or some sort of template language from IES that could be used to communicate with schools, teachers, and families about this, and template language for journal submission cover letters. I know that I am trying really hard. You guys may not know. I don't know. I don't remember what I said in my opening remarks, but we are in the midst of this like digital modernization, and we're going to have a new website, and it's going to be amazing. But part of that new website is also going to be like new backend. And so one of the things I'm trying really hard to do is get an IES sort of grantee set of pages where information about that you all need can be easily accessible, right? As opposed to having to reach out individually to your program officer for shared content. And so Shane, something like this could be very, very useful and helpful. It could also go on our SEER pages. So if people have examples of things that they think are helpful, please share with us and we will figure out what we can do to pull together.
Martha, you asked a great question about concerns about trainees not being in a position to be able to share their data. When we think about funded training programs, we're focusing on the trainees as the sort of participant of the program. And so the sharing would be at the level of what their activities are, what the outcomes are. We wouldn't be trying to burrow into sharing of their projects specifically. However, this is, whatever they're working on is still going to be part of this community-wide change. And so depending on what the sort of sources are and supports are there, we're certainly going to still want to encourage sharing. And that's where you get into issues of considering sort of what some of the limitations are on being able to share from for secondary data, for example.
Yeah, I think particularly around data, just to follow up, I think, Martha, I know that Katina and Meredith have been working really hard to try to get the trainees sort of in the practice of sharing their publications, right? And that being part of it. But I think the data question is something that we are not seeing, at least don't see that as being connected up with the fellows, because you're right, we don't pay for all the data necessarily.
Right.
But it's going to be really interesting as there is this broad culture change, right? That's happening, like, because foundations are having this stuff as well. So it's like, it's everybody. It's not just us.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, sure, Martha, of course.
Good to see you, Martha.
I know. Hi, Fred. I know I didn't get to see you. I had questions from people, but no faces. It's so nice to see faces. Sorry.
Let's see, Allison, you raised a good question about interfacing with data security issues. Absolutely, of course, this is part of what we're needing to think through and provide guidance on. And everything that you all are raising here is really helpful for us in terms of thinking through some of the non-prototypical cases that are sort of at our easy fingertips, or sort of nuances that we need to be anticipating and developing guidance around.
Yeah. And Laura, did you see Desiree's comment?
Yeah, I was just about to respond to that one next. Yeah, no, that's fine. You can go ahead.
No, you should go.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, this is a real problem. So Desiree asked about concerns with parents not wanting to consent to share data, right, outside of the immediate study, and that could really result in some biased sampling. This is part of not a lot of conversations that have happened around recruitment during this meeting, for example, are around sort of wariness, suspicion around science in general and parent reluctance. I think that we do need to be cognizant of the need to try to think through how to present the information in a way that sort of helps to reassure parents about the protected nature of their data, their children's data. But it's a legitimate point to be thinking about in terms of the culture change in general is if the sort of standard level of operation now is that we are collecting data for the world, for the community, for everyone to be able to benefit from. It's a different enterprise than just I've connected with Dr. Murray and I'm comfortable with her having access to my kids' information, right? So I think that we need to be thinking about that sort of the communication element of that in terms of how we think about talking about sharing data and data protections.
Yeah.
And just to piggyback on that, a suggested resource is, I think you all, if you had some required language to share, that would be way better than what my university could come up with.
Yeah.
It would be much more family, parent, school appropriate than if we left it to individual universities.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. I was just thinking it's becoming clear in this conversation, which is why we're so glad we're having it, in terms of like this sort of templated language that can be useful across the multiple dimensions that are happening here, that we're talking about. Anjali, you asked a question, if you make a version available publicly on your website or through a working paper series, does that help with the zero embargo policy in terms of getting it into ERIC? So certainly for ERIC, you can submit any peer reviewed publication, a scholarly publication that has come out of IES funding to ERIC. You don't need to wait. And in fact, one of the best things for everyone to try to get into the habit of doing, and I think this is one of the things that the little video clips that I sent last night say, is as soon as you receive acceptance and you have your final accepted manuscript, even if it's not pretty yet, is to go ahead and submit that to ERIC, because then ERIC has it and they can then release it when that zero embargo hits. I know sometimes, particularly early on when we were starting to implement this, people would wait until the article had actually been published before they submitted it to ERIC. And then we were in this kind of complicated process where we were trying to match across different records. It's much easier if you do it from the beginning, but watch that video that I sent out if you have questions or concerns, because I do know that is something that was addressed.
Nicole, you bring up a really important question and concern and sensitivity around, we were talking about, equity on the back end in terms of access versus equity on the front end in terms of being able to participate and contribute, right? So the concern is for smaller research labs that can't just churn out publications, 5 minutes after data is collected, that there could be some real equity issues there around getting scooped, right? If I have to share my data right after I finish collecting it and I don't have the resources to be able to publish it, then somebody else is going to publish off those data before I get to it. That's the kind of thing that we're thinking about and taking into account as we're developing our guidance and our implementation, is what's a reasonable timeline to give folks a chance to be able to get those data out. And it's exactly why we need to be able to monitor and think about what are the consequences once we start to implement these things, so that we can recognize quickly if there are systematic discrepancies that are happening in opportunities as a result of this, the spirit of openness creating some inequities that weren't there before.
Yeah, sorry, I'm typing fast. Because Shane has another point here, but I wanted to actually respond to somebody ahead of that. So Daphne, you asked, will journals be required to follow the zero embargo, or do we have to inform journals of this requirement and get their agreement, knowing that we may need to submit elsewhere if they won't comply? Okay, and this is actually kind of linked to Shane's point about journals prohibiting posting of the author's accepted manuscript. So there's a couple of things going on here. The first is that ERIC, not me, thank goodness, but Erin Pollard, who's my colleague at ERIC, she is actively engaged in renegotiating all of the agreements that ERIC has with journals. And as part of that, it will be the zero embargo. So our goal is to get to a place where we're all doing that. But this is going to be happening over the next 2.5 years, right? And we are not the only ones. Like I said, this is everybody across the federal government. And so really, it's going to be very, very interesting to see how this plays out. So the short answer is, I can't answer your question fully yet, Daphne, but we are working on that and trying to get there. The other piece that I want, go ahead.
Can I just add one thing?
Please, please.
The publishers know that this is happening, and this is the U.S. federal government mandating this. Europe has already gone there, right? The publishers are going to have to comply in some way or other. So this is not you, like David and Goliath here. You're not on your own. This is a system-wide change that's happening.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's really interesting. And like Doug Clements was saying earlier, that he's the NCTM on the board of NCTM's journals. And that's a professional society's journals and I don't know who your publisher is, right? But whomever the publisher is the one that is engaged in conversations with ERIC, right? So it becomes kind of complicated. And we know that there are particular publishing houses that are, can I say bad actors and not get in trouble? That I would call as bad actors in this, and even in this current environment, right? Who are really resisting against doing this. But again, it is international. It is not just us, and it is federal wide that we're pushing to this. Zero embargo already exists, like Laura said, in which set of G nations I can't remember. But what is it called? Open Zeros, Open S, the S plan, Open S plan, the S plan. I can't remember. We don't do international stuff like that, so I can never remember the names. Our colleagues are like doing this. But the other thing, so Shane's point about they don't explicitly allow posting of the author's accepted manuscript. I want to remind everyone, and this is something that I'm currently thinking a lot about, and I think we all are federally wide, is to make sure you read your agreement when you're when you're submitting a journal publication, because you don't want to be in a situation where you have inadvertently given away your copyright, which is what can happen and gets you into trouble when you're trying to submit your author's accepted manuscript, right? So we're trying to provide you all with templates, but we're also trying to figure out how can we work with the publishing community to make sure that there are opportunities, like if there's a button to click that says, this project was supported through federally funded research dollars, you guys already have to cite that. So there should be a way to make sure that you all are routed, if you will, on the right path, the correct path, where you don't have to, where you're not sort of giving away your copyright without even realizing you're doing so. And Laura, you probably have more to say on that. That's more articulate than what I just said.
Nothing specific, just to say that, yes, you want to err on the side of retaining rights and on being able to share. Yes. I was going to follow up on a couple of different things. One is I noticed that someone, Paul, you mentioned Databrary. I think Databrary is a great model for this. For those of you who are not aware, it tends to be with most of the data that's shared there is with younger kids, and it's a video-based archive. So people are actually uploading identifiable information, unequivocally into a sort of closed database that you have to have access to. But they have developed a really nice system for helping people to curate data from the beginning, so that they are setting up and archiving their data as they're collecting it, if people choose to, within Databrary. So it sort of helps to hold your hand and set up a sharing process for you, because then you just share at the click of a button when you're ready. Another thing that Erin, you brought up was the cost of data sharing curation. I think that that's really important. Liz made a comment in the chat about, we're thinking about that. But for now, as you're thinking about developing new proposals, new applications, do be thinking about, it's not a zero cost endeavor to have to set up data in a way that you can curate and share. So be thinking about costs associated with that when you're developing budgets.
Hey, Kent has a question here that I'm not sure I understand. Kent, you said, do you see it? Do you understand?
I didn't quite understand it either.
Okay, so Kent, come on screen and help us understand your question.
Sorry about that. I was just thinking about that idea about people coming in and grabbing data and then kind of sneaking in on it. I'm wondering if typically what we do with our data repositories is we keep a list of research questions that are already being asked, so that when an external data user makes a request that is essentially identical or asking for the same data, then we can turn back to them and say, I'm sorry, somebody is already asking that question, and they'll be able to release these, we'll be able to release these data later after they've had a crack at it. And I was just sort of thinking that one other thing to do is, if we were to, right before we were going to release our data, also release it with a list of the pre-registered projects that are related to it. That way we can have a set of future questions that are sort of preserved for the group that actually did the work in gathering the data.
Yeah,
I think that's a great idea. I think, obviously we're moving to an environment where, sorry, you can't do that until we've taken care of it first is sort of antithetical to the open science framework that we're adopting here. But linking to pre-registration or having an accompanying, you've got your code book, and then you've got your sort of research questions guide that sort of is being transparent about what you're currently working on, I think is in the spirit of sort of taking a more collaborative approach. And then if someone else is interested in using the data for a similar set of questions, there's an opportunity for a conversation there, maybe a collaboration, a replication, right? And so I think that is exactly the kind of thing that sort of helps to us to sort of shift our lens about what this data sharing means. It's not giving away the farm. It's just making sure that people are aware of what's being worked on and where there might be opportunities to enhance.
Yeah, so these are great suggestions. Allison and Aaron are having a conversation here about thinking about the rich metadata and the access to restricted use data sets and the NCES data set and restricted use data set process. This is a known problem. I just want to put it out there that we are aware of this and we are trying to come up with some internal solutions that could potentially help. But there are challenges, right, in terms of making sure that NCS is meeting its mandate, or we as IES are meeting our mandate to not identify people, but this is something we all struggle with. So there are internal conversations. I don't have an answer yet. I just want to let you know that thank you for putting your example in here, and it'll help us as we're continuing to think about how to make this better for everybody. All right, let me just see what else.
I was just gonna pop in the chat. So Liz had mentioned, oops, I didn't do that right. Nope, that's not what I was trying to do. The Coalition S or Plan S is the European consortium that guides the European funders in openness, and they're like way ahead of us in terms of implementing this. Sorry, I'm having copy and paste issues here. Here we go. Just in case folks are interested in sort of where that is.
Let's get it going. All right. Are there any questions that we have not addressed that have come up that you guys feel free to just pop on screen and start talking? Don't need to, we're not in a class. Does anyone want to share any success stories? I'm looking at Mike Weiss because I know Mike Weiss has created this massive data set that is available for people to share. Now, granted, it's out of MDRC stuff, but do you want to share any like possibilities, affordances that happen in terms of sharing the data?
Well, one, thanks for the little advertisement for the data set. It's very cool. It's at ICPSR and it's called the Higher Education Randomized Controlled Trials Project. If anyone wants to go check it out, there's like individual participant data from over 30 different RCTs that we conducted from 2003 to 2019. I feel like the things that we did well that made that possible was that almost all of the studies, first of all, it was higher ed, so almost all the studies actually had individual informed consent. So we made sure we included stuff in informed consents about the data sharing. And we worked primarily with individual colleges, which allowed, and they, either because they didn't check as carefully as other state agencies or because they just were kind, were more comfortable, I think, with having data sharing agreements that allowed this. I feel like since I've talked to other post-secondary researchers about this, I'm not quite as sure that those who work with state agencies feel as confident in their ability to do this kind of thing because they seem to be much more restrictive. But yeah, I mean, because we got a grant to put the whole data set together too, we didn't have to deal with some of the costs that you have to deal with if you do it one at a time, because we created one code book for all of them and we tried to create standardized variables for all of them. So I do think there's some advantages that exist when you do it for more than one study at a time. But I do think some of that has been sort of fortuitous for being part of one organization that had done all these studies together.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Mike. All right, Vivian, you commented, so I'm going to call on you. So sorry, guys, I've turned this into a class I wasn't intending to. But I know Vivian is a meta-analyst and does meta-analytic work. And sort of one of the use cases that we often talk about is like, why does it matter to think carefully about our code and our data? And Vivian, you can talk much more eloquently about this than I can, so I'm going to give you the floor.
Oh, well, what I was going to say, and thank Mike in the chat, was that when I got a new graduate student and they were looking for a project, I directed them to look at this data set, of which they did. But what was also really helpful about it was that the documentation was really helpful and it was really nicely and concisely done in such like a model that in a really clear way that we actually used your documentation as a model for creating code books as examples for, I was able to share it with my graduate students to be able to say, hey, take a look at this. Let's take some of the practices that you guys used and incorporate it into our own lab. So, as a plug, I think that one of the things that's really helpful about sort of sharing the data sets and especially the documentation for this, which, I don't know that we systematically teach very well in graduate training programs, but are issues that we all deal with. But to have really good models of this, in addition to the guidance that IES and the federal government has put out, has been really, really helpful, I think, for doing that. I guess, Liz, just to answer your question, I'm not a meta analyst, but I have many friends who are. But what I will say is that I really do think that efforts for researchers to collaborate together to both plan studies collaboratively on the front end, as well as analyze results from multiple studies like that. I think IES has done such a great job in sort of encouraging the field to be able to improve individual studies. And I think the next step of the way is to thinking about ways for how we can plan multiple studies to attack big research questions as well as interpret results. And we can't do that unless we know what these effects actually mean and how to interpret them.
Thank you. All right, guys. I know we have some more time, so I don't want to end us prematurely, but I do want to make sure that if folks want to drop off before the closing session and you have to come back because we're going to have some fun together and I want everyone to be there, is that we will be we will be posting our plan in the not too distant future. I just kind of wanted to lay out what the steps are so that everyone knows what's happening. So our plan has been, we've drafted the revised plan. It's been reviewed by OSTP and OMB, and we got thumbs up, which makes us very, very happy. So what we now need to do is, because it's a department plan, not an IES plan, it needs to go through departmental clearance. We need to make sure that there aren't any questions or concerns from our colleagues in the department. And then IES is going to post it. We may have opportunities for formal public comment, but we, again, because it's a department guide, not an IES guide, I can't make any particular promises about how that's going to happen. I will say I'm going to capture all this chat. I want you all, if you have questions, concerns, please, please, please send them to me. Once the document goes up, we'll put out a news flash. Will it provide an opportunity for folks to send us comments? The more input we get, the better we can move forward with implementation and make sure that we're generating and creating the resources that need to be done. Need to be created, right? And need to be shared and need to be available for everyone. All right. So Laura, what else do we need to say? Is there anything else? Does anyone else have any other questions? Here,
yeah, so this is Russell Almond. I wanted to follow up on my question and comment about the need to document instruments that are used in the study. A long while ago, I was involved in the IMS consortium's work on a question and test interoperability standard. And it occurs to me that it would be useful to have a sort of a standard like that could be used to output instruments that are used in studies. Now, IMS is the IMS QTI standard is a bit overkill for a typical, Qualtrics questionnaire, but there also might be something that's easily exportable from Qualtrics or SurveyMonkey or Google Forms or the other things that people are using that produces an electronic record of one-off instruments that are used in studies.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to overlook your comment. I think that's actually a helpful one and we'll think about it. I haven't thought about it, so I don't have a good answer, but I really appreciate the suggestion because it hasn't really come up in our conversations around assessments. So it's something for us to definitely take back and think about.
Although I think there's also some challenges there because people often use proprietary instruments in their studies, and then it's harder to publish, item level data.
Yep, true.
Transparency to the extent that we can make it transparent.
That's our goal.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I'm just really grateful that so many of you have turned up. That people have been so helpful as thought partners in thinking through what some of the pain points or complications or nuances could be. I think we're hearing that some like template language and guidance would be helpful, whether and what cases we can actually do that. it remains to be seen, but it's definitely something that we can recognize the utility of and want to help to empower you all to make these changes as comfortably, as smoothly, and as effectively as possible. I really appreciate the sort of spirit of receptivity that a lot of you are exhibiting here, and understand the anxieties. So we'll keep pushing this forward in a way that is as anchored to where we are now and what tools we need in order to move forward as we can.
I can only imagine the amount of work that all of you have to do behind the scenes and the stress and anxiety. So thank you as well, because we as researchers, we tend to think about how it affects us, but there's also your end. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Daphne. And you all just keep on keeping yourselves in compliance with the requirements as they stand now. And that will help us as we move in and transition into this next phase. And with that, I'm happy to stay on and chat with folks, but if folks want to break before 2:20 when we're all going to gather together, we'll do that. I'm supposed to remind you guys to fill in the survey that ACE will put in here. You guys, I'm sure, have been getting lots of surveys over the course of the past couple of days. But anyway, like I said, take a few minutes, see you at 2:20, but I'm happy to stick here. And Laura and I can stick around if folks want to have a smaller conversation. But thank you guys so much for all you do.
Liz, I had a follow-up question after this.
Of course, Vivian. Well, I figured people might, since you can't grab me in the hall. This is sort of the equivalent of the hall.
Exactly. This is the hallway.
I had a follow-up question about Reese, and I guess maybe I should have asked Rebecca because she was on here too.
Yeah.
Before Jessica left, like one of the last things she did before she moved over to NSF was that we had sort of talked about like how would people register replication studies on Reese so that you could connect basically studies with each other, right? And so this raised the question for us, like, and this actually came up in the methods conversation yesterday about like how I'm not, and just about like how do changes continue after things that IES has supported and fostered and built over time. And Jessica knew that ICPSR is hosting it, but I don't know that they have, but she wasn't sure that there are resources devoted to actually making changes and updating Reese. And so many people are using Reese. So I was just wondering if that was going to continue to be a resource for folks that will continue to get updated.
So that's a super good question, Vivian. I have not talked recently to the ICPSR team. I know I can't say it either. Too many letters about Reese. And yeah, Becca probably would have been the best person to ask that question too. But I think we can certainly take it back, and I can reach out to our colleagues at ICPSR because we don't want to lose all the investment that everyone has put into Reese, because we know there's lots of good structured data that's in there and that it's really comprehensive and useful for folks. Particularly in the context of replication questions. So more to come.
Yeah, and thinking about also just linking studies on similar study topics together.
I was going to say that's another perfect case example of why we need these identifiers, these digital identifiers, because then you can just pop in, even if there's not like a dedicated field for like, is this a replication? Yes, no, if so, what? You can pop into your abstract content a link to an identifier, and then you can know exactly which study it was a replication of, right?
Okay, I'll send you our comments that Jess and I had written about how to link that, and then feel free to forward that to anybody else. Okay, all right, thanks.
Yeah, sure. All right. More people are still here. You guys have questions, or you just want to hang out with us in this virtual
dropping in the hallway?
I do have. Hi, I've got a question that comes up sometimes with doctoral students that I've got who are in favor of open science. I'm not saying they're against it at all, but they're anxious about whether when they're going to an institution and they may not have a chance to do a postdoc, or they want to go somewhere and really focus on teacher personnel prep, but they're afraid that they won't be able to cross the divide back into research if they're choosing to be at an institution that wouldn't have the same resources that it would take to help them be compliant with open science. And I imagine that's a conversation that you all have had, but I'm wondering what advice you have for us as we mentor the next generation, and particularly individuals who might be first gens, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't know, Laura, you have any good initial thoughts? It's a really, really good question. And I don't know.
It's really important. You know, I mean, one thing that I was thinking as you were talking, Stephanie, is that one of the idealized use cases for being able to have more access to other folks' data is so that you don't have to have a lot of resources in order to conduct a study, right? So that you could, I mean, this is true for people who are at non-research intensive institutions. This is true for students, undergraduate students even, right? When I was a psychology professor, you know, this would have been a gold mine for my undergraduate honors students to be able to have data. They don't have to collect the data. They just have to figure out what the research questions are that they want to ask of them and be able to analyze them and come up with something substantive. So that is one value added to being able to have more access. I think that you know, this is part of what we need to be monitoring as we're implementing these things is, again, you know, the idealized sort of outcomes versus in practice. Are we actually creating unanticipated barriers to productivity by creating all this extra infrastructure in the spirit of sharing, right? You know, are we sort of creating a burden on researchers that makes the bar even higher for being able to be successful?
Yeah.
And go ahead, Liz.
Yeah, no, Stephanie. So I was also thinking about the institutional question that you were asking, right? When people are going across different kinds of institutions, and you know, IES doesn't have a lot of money available right now to support institutional infrastructure building, right? That's just not something that is currently in our wheelhouse in a big way. But I do know that the broader open science conversation, and Laura, you're gonna have to help me remember that I've been part of, there's a working group led by, I'm trying to think who it is. It's the National Academies is doing this, where they're working on open science and trying to think about what are the things that need to be in place for institutions around tenure, around like
incentives.
Incentives.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
What can, you know, and what counts, right? Because if you're at a teacher prep institution, or like what I was before I came at a liberal arts institution, there are going to be products that you're producing that may not fit neatly into what we're already currently talking about, but that are clearly relevant and important to the work that we're doing. And we've been talking and brainstorming and trying to think about how do you make sure that folks can get, if you will, credit for that as part of their packages as they're moving forward and across institutions. So that was what you were making me think about when you're asking your question. And if
Thank you for thinking about it and being thought partners. I'll
absolutely. We all
forward.
Yeah, we all have to be thought partners on this, because there are lots of different use cases and we're not all at the same kind of institutions. And so I think it's really important for us to be
especially once the grants end, right? Because this goes on into perpetuity. So if you are someplace where it's not supported, it can be feeling a little intimidating.
Indeed.
Anyway, thank you.
You guys are welcome. All right, I have to go because I have to go and make sure that I'm available as a speaker on the next session. Laura, I don't know where you're at.
I'll stick around for a few more minutes in case anybody has anything
else. It's all good.
Until you've all abandoned me.
It's so good to see. Well, 2:15 is when we're supposed to end. So
yes,
talk to you all soon.
This was probably said before and I just missed it. But I think the idea is go, Liz.
Okay. Sorry, Doug. I was like, I want to make sure. Okay.
Yeah, you have to hear what he has to say.
This is so simple that, and I'm sure you mentioned, I'm sure it's in the documentation, but when I was submitting to Eric, I think, and doing a report to IES on that we did submit to Eric, I think it was like, if it's an open access journal, no, you don't have to give it to Eric. Is that right? And is that still policy or no?
No, we really want to have a record. So you can share what the, you know, sort of the link is, and then you don't have to actually upload the article itself. But because that is our sort of repository for education research, we do want to have you registered in ERIC for everything.
So you might have all the information in it, but maybe not the Word doc
Yeah,
turn
you could just include the link to the DOI, and then
I
people can
think
get
we
there.
can
And
do that right, Laura. So don't tell Liz or anyone else, but I'll try to go back.
you can go back and look. And by the way, you know, Liz mentioned that Erin Pollard is our ERIC guru. And she's very, very helpful and resourceful. And so if you have questions about how to amend or anything, feel free to reach out to her.
Who is that? Laura?
Erin Pollard is her name, and she's the voice of the video that you got yesterday through G5. So
Is it like this? That like the name in the chat there?
yes, yeah,
Spelled right? Okay,
yes.
I will make sure I get in contact with her. Thanks so much for the session. It was great.
Of course. I'm glad it was helpful. Anybody else have any?
Laura, I
I
have a
see you
question.
coming on screen. Yeah.
I have a question about the pre-registration. So we have done that. We have a goal 3. We have done that with our main study findings, but now we have students conducting side questions and, you know, using pieces of the data to answer different questions, not our main study questions.
Yeah.
Should those be pre-registered as well?
So I think that sort of broadly speaking, yes. I think one of the questions for you in terms of how you think about how your research team is structured and the research questions are structured is, does that get its own pre-registration, or are you amending the existing pre-registration to add on questions? I think if it's a new project with a new set of research questions, typically I think that would involve pre-registration of a new study or project that's relying on the same data. But I really think that that's up to your discretion. I think that, you know, the spirit of pre-registration is just to be transparent about what questions you're asking and how you're planning to ask them, what hypotheses you have, what analyses you're planning, so that people can see that you had a plan at the beginning and stuck to it, or that you generated some reasons to alter it. And so you're being transparent about the fact that you've adjusted the plan. How you actually sort of plug those in, you know, I think is up to your discretion, but it, you know, you wouldn't, I think you could be transparent about this so you wouldn't need to worry, but you wouldn't want it to look like, oh, we changed our research questions, you know, because you were augmenting with some additional questions, unless those were questions that came out of, oh, we had this initial set of findings, which led us to dig a little deeper. And so then you want that thread to be documented. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so. I mean, they're completely different questions. We wouldn't need to amend, but I just wondered about the requirement. Some of them are just for conference presentations. They're small, you know, ends and.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could think about that as not necessarily being, you know, that the work is being funded by IES, for example, if it was sort of a side project that was repurposing those data. But I think that sort of part of our message here today is that it's just good practice to be pre-registering in general. Oop, did I lose her? Oh, there she is. You moved on the screen because somebody else jumped off. Sorry, I was looking at you on the screen and then you went away. You know, that it's best practice to be pre-registering anything that you're sort of investigating. But I think, you know, in terms of compliance with IES requirements, if it's something that's not part of the framework of the original application, that I think that's up to your discretion.
Okay, great. I mean, we agree with that. The idea of pre-registration is just that sometimes the conference comes up quickly and they don't.
Sure. Right. Yeah. Sure. Anything else? Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you all for joining. I really appreciate everyone's input, and we'll see you on the closeout session. Take care, all.